Listen to the old folk songs of the Ozarks, and you'll hear the mournful tale of Captain Bill Darke. The ballads describe a dashing Confederate martyr, a man who gave his life defending Southern honor against overwhelming odds. That romantic image of the war vanishes the moment you look at the reality of the Arkansas foothills in 1863. The region was a freezing, mud-soaked landscape where survival was a daily struggle. Under orders from Confederate command, irregular bushwhackers implemented a ruthless slash-and-burn policy. They were instructed to destroy any supplies that might fall to the Union, which effectively meant looting farms, burning crops, and terrorizing their own neighbors. The real war in these hills played out at the corners of smokehouses and the edges of freezing woods. It was a conflict defined by proximity and sudden, intimate violence. Down in a remote valley called Slough, two widows, Mrs. Bloodworth and Aunt Sally Smith, were busy boiling water in a massive iron kettle to scald and butcher a dead hog. Inside the nearby cabin lay the body of Mrs. Bloodworth's sister, who had passed away during the night. The living had no time for mourning. The hog had to be processed before the meat spoiled, leaving the deceased sister completely unattended. 15-year-old Jim Barry watched from the woodpile. Jim was a deserter who had briefly tended horses for a local raiding gang before fleeing the cruelty of the war. Now he sat retching at the smell of blood, clutching a tiny pistol like a toy. The peace was shattered when Captain Bill Darke burst into the clearing. The vain, red-headed officer vaulted his gray horse over the fence, performing a display of martial skill for a cowering audience he assumed was waiting for him. Darke had isolated 3 people in a remote hollow. He believed he held absolute power over defenseless prey. Instead of screaming, the widows were mostly annoyed by the interruption. Mrs. Bloodworth didn't even stop scraping the hog, simply telling the fearsome raider to mind the sweet potatoes roasting in the fire. Darke's focus shifted when he spotted Jim Barry. He recognized the boy as the one witness who knew the truth about his previous war crimes, a witness who could not be allowed to leave. Jim bolted. The teenager scrambled through the slop of the yard with the mounted officer in hot pursuit, circled the cabin's stick-and-dirt chimney, their breathing heavy in the freezing air as the horse's hooves churned the mud into soup. Jim flattened himself against the smokehouse wall, trapped. Darke rounded the corner with his gun drawn. Even here, vanity took precedence. Wanting to look like a dashing hero, Darke paused to pull his leather glove off with his teeth before taking aim. He pulled the trigger. Click. The gun jammed. The cap had fallen off the tube. In that split second, the cornered boy squeezed his eyes shut and fired blindly, striking Darke squarely between the eyes. The raider's legendary career ended because of a single narcissistic pause. A terrified boy fired blind and won a battle that military logic says he should have lost. Hearing the single shot and seeing the riderless gray horse gallop away, Darke's men panicked. They assumed they had stumbled into a coordinated military ambush and fled into the winter woods. Mrs. Bloodworth walked over to the corpse. Recalling how the man had once tortured her, she kicked him in the teeth and told him he could keep the sweet potatoes. Aunt Sally noticed her stolen wedding ring on Darke's dead finger. Tugging wouldn't move it, so she used her butchering knife to chop the finger off at the knuckle, tossed the ring into the kettle to boil, and went back to work. They dragged the body to a clay hole under a walnut tree. Following a grim local superstition, they buried him face down so he could never scratch his way out. The survival of these women depended on a total lack of sentimentality. Their ruthless pragmatism ended the raider's life and destroyed his grand military illusions in a single afternoon. In the years following the war, Darke's unceremonious death in a mud hole became a significant problem for those trying to preserve the memory of the conflict. This was the era of the lost cause. Southern romantics were working to frame the Confederacy as a noble, pure endeavor. The story of a thieving raider killed by a teenager over a pig did not fit the narrative of heroic sacrifice. To fix the record, historians simply rebranded him. New accounts described Darke as a heroic martyr, while others shifted his crimes onto the Union by labeling him a jayhawker. Decades of history books preserved this sanitized version of the captain's end. Meanwhile, in the mud of Slough, the fingerless skeleton remained face down exactly where it fell. The ballads play on for the crowds in Mountain View, celebrating a version of history that never actually existed. Below the walnut tree at Kenner Slough, the dirt keeps the truth.